When suffering knocks at your door and you say there is no seat for him, he tells you not to worry because he has brought his own stool. Suffering and pain have a way of getting into our lives, even though we don't want them. Even though we don't look for them, even though we don't share our address and invite them over for dinner. We've been saying over the last 3 weeks, as we've started this teaching series on suffering, that suffering in this world is inevitable. We will face suffering. Maybe not to the same extent as someone else. It's not that everyone gets it in equal measure. And maybe not for the same duration. But life in a broken world involves pain, broken relationships, broken structures and systems, broken bodies, broken hopes and dreams. And that's not pleasant. But if suffering is to be expected rather than just an unlucky break for some, then one of the questions that we need to ask is, how do we make the best of our suffering? Is there a way to not waste our sorrows? Or to put it another way, how might we grow through suffering? Now, it's pretty important here to say that there's a time and a place for this question. When you're not in suffering and you need to prepare for it, you say, I'm not really in a tough situation now, but I'll probably face it at some point, then that's a good time to ask it. When you're on the other side of a particularly intense period of suffering and you're trying to learn and grow and continue to heal, that's not a bad time to ask it as well. When you're in the valley of suffering, well, that might be a hard time to try and reflect on how you can grow. And we said last week that what we need in the valley is the strong medicine of the unbreakable love of God in Jesus Christ, expressed, shown, demonstrated in his suffering death. That's what we need to cling to when you're in the valley. Joni Eareckson Tada, who became a paraplegic after a diving accident at age 17, wrote recently, "Through the decades, I have learned that when you're hemorrhaging human pain, answers, even if they are good, right, and true, can sting like salt in a wound. Answers are good when you're asking why with an open heart, but they can do damage when you're asking why with a clenched fist." And so it may be that today's message for you is just a little bit less the question that you can ask and process on right now, and that's okay. But at the same time, the Bible does say some things that sound absurd and unrecognizably strange. We read one of them in our reading from Romans chapter 5, verse 3. Paul says, not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings. Some translations, we rejoice in our sufferings. How can that possibly be the case? How can you boast or rejoice in suffering? Here's another example in the letter of James. James, the brother of Jesus, writes a letter to some of the members of the early church, and he writes at the beginning of his letter, chapter 1, verse 2, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds." And again, it just forces us to ask this question: why and how can we consider the various trials, the difficulties that we experience in life to be pure or maybe exceeding joy? How does that even work? Might it be possible to have a deep undercurrent of joy even through the hardships of life? And today I have a simple, big idea that helps us to see how even our sufferings might be an occasion for rejoicing. It's this. This is the big idea. God uses trials to make us, not break us. God uses trials to make us, not break us. And so to unpack that, we're going to look at some of these passages under two headings. Number one, the metaphors for suffering that the Bible gives. And number two, the work of suffering. Metaphors for suffering and the work of suffering. See, the Bible uses different metaphors to describe suffering. And one of the metaphors that it uses is the image of a furnace. It wasn't in the readings that we had this morning, but it comes up particularly in 1 Peter, which contains this theme of enduring and growing through suffering. And Peter starts his letter by writing about the greatness of salvation and the hope in God's future that can be so confident because it's based on the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And then he says, chapter 1, verse 6, "In this you rejoice, even if now for a little while you have had to suffer various trials, so that the genuineness of your faith, being more precious than gold, that though perishable is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed." So you've got this image of a furnace and testing like fire, and the richness of the image is because fire can do different things. See, fire can consume. It devours wood and other organic substances and turns them into ash. Fire is dangerous. And one of the things that suffering can do is it can consume you. Suffering is hard. It feels like the intense heat of a furnace. And if you're not prepared for it, or if we don't learn how to respond well to it, it can leave us far worse than when we were before it. But fire can also purify and refine. That's what fire does to metals. If you want pure gold, you've got to test it by fire. You've got to put it in the hot furnace so that the dross, that's all the other metal and other substances that are not the gold, they melt away. And so what you're left with is what's valuable. And when it comes to pain and suffering, they can also have this refining effect on you. They can make you a better person than you were before. If suffering is like a furnace, then there are two possibilities. Either the fire can consume you, leading to responses that will weaken your character and cause you to become bitter and hard and unkind, or the fire will be like that of a refiner's fire. And suffering and pain, though hard, and though they may take some time to work through, and though it never feels like we're making great strides, can lead us to remarkable growth. But one of the things about suffering is that it won't leave you unchanged. It will either produce one thing or another, but it won't leave you the same. So that's the image of a furnace. But then there's another image that the Bible uses, the New Testament, and that is of a gymnasium. Suffering's like a gymnasium. We heard that actually in our reading from Hebrews. It starts with this picture of the realm of a family. God is a father and we are his children. And the writer says that we're to endure trials as discipline. A family relationship, parent and child, because God disciplines those he loves just as an earthly parent disciplines their child because they love them. And we could explore a lot there. That's another metaphor as well. But for the minute, just come with me to Hebrews chapter 12, verse 11, where the writer says this. Now, discipline always seems painful rather than pleasant at the time, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. The word for trained in Greek is the word gymnazo, from which we get our English word gymnasium. It's a word that literally meant to exercise, which in the Greek world meant exercising naked. But then it gets used figuratively as well, in the sense of being trained in some way, so as to build character or wisdom, or here in Hebrews 12, the fruit of righteousness. That which is fitting for those who have been given the new life in Christ. And there are two things to notice about the image. Number one, suffering is exposing, and training is exposing. For the ancient Greek world, as I just said, it meant stripping off. You had to show what was underneath. And thankfully, if you go for a walk or a run around the bay this afternoon, you shouldn't have to see someone flash you. But we do change our clothes when we exercise, and usually, actually, we put on clothes that reveal more of our bodies than normal. Everyone can see your dad bod. You can see the way that your arms and your legs lack the tone you wish they had. And if you go to a gym, there's mirrors everywhere, constantly reflecting back to you what you look like. Plus maybe a few people who are just peacocking around, looking at themselves in the mirror, rather than getting on with the exercise. But of course, the point of being able to see yourself is part of the point. You need an honest assessment of where you're at if you want to grow and improve. It doesn't help to ignore the fact that you're weak or unfit or whatever it is. You've got to start somewhere, and being realistic with where you are and what you're hoping to get to is part of the process, and suffering can be the same. See, one of the things about suffering is that it removes unrealistic pride and self-reliance. Without suffering and difficulty, when our lives are going well and easy, we live often under the assumption that we're basically in control. But when we're hit by challenging circumstances, it forces us to realize that we've been completely unrealistic. We never had the kind of control that we believed and assumed that we did. We're dependent on God. We're vulnerable. We need his protection and his strength. And it's not that we suddenly become vulnerable and dependent in those moments of suffering. It's just that they reveal to us what has always been the case. But the second part of the image of a gymnasium is that training strengthens you. It's paradoxical, really, because when you're training, it actually feels like you're getting weaker. Have you noticed that? You get to the end of a run and you're exhausted. You lift weights and you think, my arms are getting weaker than they were before. Your muscles get fatigued. The fibers actually break down in your body. And you might be barely able to walk after the experience. But over time, getting weaker enables you to become stronger. And the writer of Hebrews says that suffering always seems to be unpleasant at the time. But later it yields a harvest. It can make you a stronger person, and while that's not pleasant and evil is an enemy of God and God is grieved by it, we need to hold on to all of those truths that we've established over the last few weeks. Even so, even with all of that established and in the ground, suffering and pain can make you into something beautiful. Something gracious and glorious. You know that a lump of coal under pressure and over time becomes a diamond. And if you are in Christ, what God says to you is that your suffering can make you glimmer and sparkle. It can grow in you grace and glory. And so it's worth asking, do you have confidence that God might be working good out of your pain and hardship, even if you can't see it? Remember Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers out of their jealousy, and who wound up in Egypt, and through a series of twists and turns went from being a slave at the bottom of the social hierarchy to becoming the first minister of Pharaoh, the second of power in all of the land. And he used that position to be able to help people, look after them in the midst of a severe famine, both the people of Egypt, but also those coming in from outside, including his family. And at the end of Genesis, the brothers are feeling completely ashamed because they've met Joseph again and they've realized who he is and what they have done. And Joseph says to them, "You intended to do harm to me. That was evil. But God intended it for good, in order to preserve many people as he is doing today." And our experience won't look like Joseph's. It's not always the case that something big and grand, like what happens in his case, is the outcome of our suffering. But even if it is just shaping and changing and molding and growing us, do you trust that God might have a good purpose that he is working, even in the midst of the bad that is your suffering? Well, if that's the case, then we need to move out of this little look at the metaphors of suffering and then just ask this question: what is suffering producing? And this is our second point, the work of suffering. See, I think we've established so far that suffering can do two things. It can either be unproductive or it can be productive. And unproductive suffering is suffering that doesn't lead to growth. We can't see any meaning in the suffering. We see it simply as an interruption of the freedom to live as makes us happiest. And so we don't ask God in the midst of it, "God, what are you teaching me here? What are you doing here? How can this grow my trust in you?" But productive suffering, on the other hand, it produces or it works something good in our lives. And we see that mostly in that passage from Romans chapter 5. You might like to turn to it. Otherwise, I'm going to read a few verses for us here. See, Paul says, "Therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand, and we boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God." He says we boast in hope of sharing the glory of God. But then he says, and not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. What's the work of suffering? Suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character. Character produces hope. And so let's look at these three terms here in turn one after the other. Suffering leads to endurance. Endurance is a word that means to remain under. And the image that it brings up for you is the idea of carrying a heavy load, a pack or a weight for a long time. And significantly, endurance often describes persisting in something that is difficult and that's not chosen or desired. It's not that you've taken up a heavy load because you wanted it, it's because a heavy load's been thrust on you and you've just got to deal with it. New Testament scholar Lynn Cohick describes it this way. She says, in modern English, endurance is sometimes used as a pseudonym for perseverance, another important virtue. Perseverance, however, is about choosing and remaining in that course of action, while endurance, as Paul uses it in Romans, carries a sense of passivity. Endurance is about not choosing, but allowing others to choose your course. It's about having your hands tied by cancer, your feet bound by unemployment, your arms and legs drawn and quartered by an unfaithful spouse. It is the reality of evil being done to you, on you, at you. And though you appear helpless in the world's eyes, biblical endurance, she says, that such a human perspective biblical endurance says that such a human perspective fails to see into the beyond, into the new heavens and new earth. It fails to see the raised cancer-free body, the raised productive body tending the new earth, the raised joyful body of the bride enjoying her wedding feast with her beloved bridegroom. Endurance is about receiving from God the gift of powerlessness. Jesus' death was ignoble, passive, and shameful. Endurance is hearing from God, as Paul did, that the thorn would not be removed because my grace is sufficient for you. It is accepting that the Messiah took up his cross, and we are to do likewise. See, what suffering can do for your faith is to make it robust, able to withstand difficulty. It's as if we're born into the Christian life with the floppy neck of a baby. But with time and in the experience of suffering, our ability to hold our head steady grows. Our neck muscles, our endurance muscles are strengthened. Suffering can make you spiritually resilient. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt, in his book The Happiness Hypothesis, he writes that there's empirical support for the ancient view that people need adversity, setbacks, and perhaps even trauma to reach the highest levels of strength, fulfillment, and personal development. The difficulties, the hard things, though they're not good things, they actually can produce in us strength, fulfillment, personal development. And the reason is that until you've been in the fire, you don't know what your faith is made of. And importantly, you don't know how deep the resources are in your faith which you can draw on when times get difficult. See, suffering, before it's a way to grow yourself, is simply a way to draw near to God as never before, to know Him better. It will transform your perspective on God. It was C.S. Lewis who said that famous quote that God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts to us in our pains. It's in our pains that God speaks most clearly and loudly. See, many people believe in God, but they have a view of God where God is basically like a personal assistant or a life coach. And the thing about a personal assistant or a life coach is if they're not doing their job, you just fire them. You get a new one. And that's what can sometimes happen, isn't it? When suffering hits, when it's difficult, we feel this temptation to just fire God, to look for something else to fill that gap. But what that shows is that we were never really treating Him as God. We were treating Him as a coach. Christianity says that we should trust God because He is God. And what suffering will do is it will expose the ways that we have been serving God for our benefit and not serving God for God. And as it does this, and as we draw near to Him because there is nothing else that we can do, because there is no one else that we can turn to, it will produce a faith that can endure anything. That's endurance. And then this endurance produces character. See, we know that suffering can bring out the worst of us. I'm sure you've seen that in your own life. Something hard happens and your reaction, your response is one that you look back on later and you said, oh, that wasn't good. That was one of my worst moments. If you're a person who is ungenerous, critical, impatient, selfish, stubborn, not a good listener, always needing to control things, then you can guarantee that suffering will bring that to the surface. And the truth is, it's not like these characteristics were not there before suffering strikes. It's just that when things are good, you can hide them. You can kind of mask over them. And sometimes we need the furnace of suffering to reveal our imperfections, to see that our faith is weak and to realize that there is growth that is needed. It forces us to pray, Lord, I don't like this version of myself. But only now can I see just how deep my sin runs. Please forgive me and change me. There's a book by an author named David Brooks who writes for the New York Times, and he wrote a book called The Road to Character. And he defines character in the book as a set of dispositions, desires, and habits that are slowly engraved during the struggle against your own weakness. A set of dispositions, desires, and habits that are slowly engraved during the struggle against your own weakness. And at one point in the book he writes, occasionally, even today, you come across certain people who seem to possess an impressive inner cohesion. They're not leading scattershot, fragmented lives. They have achieved inner integration. They are calm, settled, and rooted. They are not blown off course by storms. They don't crumble in adversity. Their minds are consistent and their hearts are dependable. Their virtues are not the virtues of blooming virtues you see in smart college students. They are the ripening virtues you see in people who have lived a little and have learned from joy and pain. Do you know people like this? I know some people like this, even in our own congregation here at St. Oswald's. Faithful Christians who you look at and you think, wow, somehow, remarkably, your trials and your adversity have not left you bitter and broken, but beautified. And so if you're here and you think of yourself as young, whether that's actually young or just young at heart, can I encourage you to want to be the kind of person that when you grow old, people look at you and they say, despite the fact that your outer self is wasting away, your inner self is being renewed day by day, and you are more godly and more gracious and more attractive as a whole person than you were when you were young. That's character. And Paul says that character produces hope. Hope is one of the most important things for human beings to have. It's like oxygen for the soul, and the promise of God is that you can have hope despite your sufferings. In fact, your sufferings can grow your hope. One of the ways that suffering does this is that it clears out false hopes. It helps you to see that personal achievement and career and financial stability or a beautiful home, all these things, they can't sustain you in the long term, and certainly not through death. But hope in the resurrection can sustain you when nothing else can. And as suffering causes all of these other hopes to melt away, what's left is the purity of a hope that is unbreakable, that can face anything. And Paul says, because this is what our sufferings can produce in us, because this is where they can lead, if we trust him and we draw near to him in the darkness, then we can even boast or rejoice in our sufferings. Not rejoice because of our sufferings. We don't long for suffering. Not rejoice in spite of our sufferings as if we're just trying to put on a brave face. No, rejoicing in our sufferings. Because we know that the suffering itself can be producing something beautiful in us.